Hello everyone, welcome to part 11 of our beginner's guide for Windows Server Active Directory, and today our topic would be Windows operating system network models. So let us look at the agenda for part 11. So we'll be covering what a client is, we'll be taking a look at what a server is, and we'll be taking a look at Windows operating system network models. So let us understand what a server is in the world of information technology. So a server can be an application or a service which requests for services and resources to a server. And a server can be an application or a service which provides the services and resources which are requested by the client. So it's very simple. Client requests for services and resources to a server, and the server provides those services and resources. So this concept is independent of an operating system. It can be any operating system, not just confined to Windows. So let's take an example over here. So we have, say, Microsoft Office Outlook, and we have a mail server. So it can be any mail server. It can be on-premises Exchange, or say Lotus Notes, or even Office 365. So this Outlook as an application will request for services, mail service to the mail server, and the mail server will provide, say, services and resources to the application as Outlook. Second example, let's take an example of a web browser. Web browser is again a client, and we have web servers, say on the internet or on our intranet as well. So these browsers will request for web pages to our web servers, and the web servers will provide those web pages to our web browser. So web browser, let's say Chrome or Edge, Firefox, they are web clients, and we have web servers around. Now we have so many operating systems, say you can have Linux, Windows, Android, say Mac, iOS, and we have some services on them. Let's say DNS service, DHCP client service, DNS client service. So these services have their own specific servers. So we have DNS servers, DNS servers, and DHCP servers. So these clients will request for DNS as a service and will receive the name resolution. And they can also go for this DHCP client service will request for an IP address for the DHCP server, and it will get an IP address from the DHCP server. So this is all about a client and a server. So the prime objective of any network is information and resource sharing. I'm talking about any network. Let's say your WhatsApp network, your LinkedIn, Instagrams, okay, your Facebook, Twitter. So all these are networks, and the prime objective is information and resource sharing. And last but not the least, YouTube, again, it's again a huge network where we share information and our resources. So the prime objective of any network is information and resource sharing. Now the prime objective of any computer network is also information and resource sharing. So again, computer is again, it's a network. So the prime objective again is information and resource sharing. So let's understand Windows operating system network models now. So there are two network models. One is a workgroup network or a workgroup model, and a domain model or a domain network. So there are only two network models for Windows operating system. It can be a client operating system or it can be a server operating system. There are only two network models That is, one of them is workgroup network and another is domain network. So let's see the difference between a workgroup network and a domain network in the world of Microsoft Windows operating system. So let's understand the difference between a workgroup network and the domain network on the basis of architecture. So we'll see how is the architecture of a workgroup network and how is the architecture of a domain network. We'll see how administration and management happens in a workgroup network and in a domain network. We'll also look at how logon and authentication happens in a workgroup network and a domain network. We'll see how which network is secured and where to implement which network. That is very important. Where will you implement a workgroup network and where will you implement a domain network? And again, last but not the least, very important point, that is the presence of Active Directory. So these are the say 6 points which I have taken. There are many other points as well. We can compare these two types of Windows based network, that is a workgroup network and a domain network. So let us look at the first point of comparison, that is the architecture. So a workgroup network is always a peer-to-peer architecture. So it means that we don't have any client-server relationship, and so every device can be a client and every device can be a server, because it's a peer-to-peer network. No one is boss and no one is subordinate over here. But a domain network is always a client-server architecture. It means some devices are clients and some devices are servers. So the client requests for services and resources to the servers, and the servers provide these services and resources which are requested by the client. So this architecture is, such architectures you can say are called as client server architecture. So let's look at the next comparison point. Okay, fine, we have this picture of a workgroup over here, and we also have the picture of a domain network over here. So the next point of comparison would be administration and management. We'll look at how a workgroup network is administered and managed and how a domain network is administered and managed. So a workgroup network is always, the administration and management is always decentralized in nature. What do you mean by decentralized? So every device in a workgroup environment needs to be administered and managed separately. So if you want to manage anything on a particular device, you have to log on to that device or that computer to manage any resource over there. But a domain network is always a centralized administration and management. Means we can administer and manage all the resources, say all the users, devices, etc., from a single console or from a single window. So it's centralized, everything is centralized in a domain environment compared to decentralized in a workgroup environment. So for example, there's a console called as Active Directory, users and computers. So we can manage all the users and computers in our domain through this single console called as Active Directory, users and computers. So here is the screenshot of our Active Directory, users and computers. So we can see so many users over here. So as an administrator, we can manage all these users from this particular single window. And we have a second screenshot of all the computers, okay, the domain joined computers. So we can manage all the computers from this Active Directory, users and computers, single window. So this is centralized administration and management. So let's look at the next comparison point of comparison, that is logon and authentication. So we'll see how logon and authentication happens in a typical workgroup environment, and how logon and authentication happens in a domain environment. So in a workgroup environment, the logon and authentication is always local. Means, say, every Windows device in a workgroup environment will maintain a local user database, and logon and authentication happens locally. But in a domain environment, the logon and authentication is always global. So there is a centralized database known as Active Directory database. This database is present on some special servers known as domain controllers. This database consists of, say, information related to users and devices on the network, and the users and devices are authenticated against this database. So there is a centralized database, and it takes care of all the authentication in a domain network, whereas in a workgroup network, every device will have its own local user database. So let's see how authentication happens in a workgroup network. So here we have 4 computers. All of them are Windows computers: PC1, PC2, PC3 and PC4, and we can see the local databases. So we have 3 users, Peter, Sandra and Sunny, which we have created on PC1. So the information, so the username and password for Peter, Sandra and Sunny are present in the local database of PC1. Now we created 4 users, Alan, Jim, Linda and John, on PC2. So the user's information will be stored in the local database of PC2. Same thing goes with PC3. We created 4 users again, Burin, Pete, Roger and Chris, on PC3, and their information will be stored on the local database of PC3. Same thing goes with PC4. We have Gary, Sam and Mark, and we have created the users in PC4. So the information of Gary, Sam and Mark will be present in the database of PC4. So Peter, Sandra and Sunny will be easily able to log on to PC1. Same thing goes with Alan, Jim, Linda and John. They will be able to log on to PC2. And again, same thing with Burin, Pete, Roger and Gary, Sam. They will be able to log on to their respective computers. So let's say Peter, Sandra or Sunny, any one of them, try to log on to PC2 with their credentials. Now the information of, say, Peter, Sandra or Sunny, anyone, is not present in the local database of PC2. So they won't be able to log in. Okay, they won't be able to log in. So we'll say that, say, bad password. Same thing goes with, if, say, Gary, Sam or Mark, any one of them tries to log on to PC3 with, say, with their credentials. Again, same thing will happen. PC3 will look into its database, the local database, if the username and password is present or not. If it's not present, it will not allow them to log on, and so on and so forth. If Alan, Jim, Linda or John, anyone logs on to PC3, same thing is going to happen. It will check against its own local database and the logon attempt will fail. So this is how logon and authentication happens in a typical workgroup network. So let's understand how logon and authentication happens in a domain network now. Now in a domain network, as you know, that we have Active Directory taking care of our logon and authentication, and it's always, the logon and authentication is always global in nature. It's not like local. So we have a domain name contoso.com and we have so many users over here, and we have created these users in our Active Directory, and we have, say, some domain joined devices. Let's say we have server 101, laptop 34, SQL Server 12. Now all these devices will have their own local database as well. Okay, don't forget that they will have their own local database as well. Now we have created so many users in our Active Directory. So these users are not present in the local database. So let's say we have a user named Robert who tries to log on server 101 using his domain credentials, his Active Directory credentials, and his secret password. So this authentication will come down to our domain controller. Okay, so our domain controller will check in its database if the username and the password is correct or not. So if the username and password is correct, then Robert will be able to log on to server 101. Now Robert again tried to log on to our SQL Server 12 using the same username and his secret password. So the same authentication will the request will again come down to our domain controller, and if the username and password matches, then and then only Robert will be able to log on to the SQL Server. So in this example we can see that Robert is using the same username and password to log on to multiple computers, and here the local database is not coming into picture. Instead, our Active Directory database is coming into picture over here. Let's take another example. We have a user named Sandra. She tries to log on to SQL Server 12 with a domain username contoso/Sandra. She provides her password. Now this request again comes down to domain controller for authentication, and unfortunately Sandra provided a wrong password, so the domain controller will not allow Sandra to log on to SQL Server. So this is how global logon and authentication takes place in a domain environment. So the local databases will never come into picture in global logon and authentication in a domain environment. Okay, by default you will be logging on using your global or your domain credentials, but sometimes you require to log on using local account as well in the corporate environment, but not every time. So let us take up with our next comparison point, that is security. So workgroup networks are comparatively less secured than domain networks because we don't have much choice to implement any policies in a workgroup network, and it is very difficult to configure access controls in our workgroup network. But in a domain network is comparatively more secured than workgroup network because we can implement group policies. We can implement role-based access control. We can restrict users from accessing certain resources. And we can also implement specific configurations for users and computers in a domain environment. So workgroup networks are comparatively less secured. Domain networks are more secured. So next point of comparison is implementation. So we need to understand where to implement a workgroup network and where to implement a domain network. So typically workgroup networks are implemented where resource sharing is more important than security. Okay, so we are more concerned with resource sharing. We are not concerned with security. So in such scenarios you will implement a workgroup network. For example, a typical cyber cafe. So in a typical cyber cafe, you will have say 10-12 computers. All of them are connected with a switch. We have a single internet connection which is shared amongst all the computers. We have say a single printer which is again shared amongst all the computers. So we are sharing the resource, we are focusing on sharing, then security. So let's say anyone coming to the cyber cafe is allowed to say plug in their personal pen drives and hard drives, whatever, to the computer. So we are least bothered about security. So tomorrow if any virus comes in, we are okay with it. We will format all the computers and we will rebuild our say cyber cafe network. So we implement, so because we have implemented, we are least bothered about security, and that's the reason we are say building a work group network in a cyber cafe. So remember, work group networks are implemented where resource sharing is more important than security. But a domain network is implemented where security is more important than resource sharing. Now, as we have already discussed, any network, the prime objective of any network is resource sharing. So workgroup networks are also meant for resource sharing, and domain networks are also meant for resource sharing. But in a domain network, security has say higher precedence over resource sharing. So a domain network is implemented where security is more important than resource sharing. Example, any business, it can be a small business to a very large business. So most of the businesses implement a domain network because they are more concerned about security than resource sharing. There will be a resource sharing in a domain network, but more say preference is given to security than resource sharing. So let us understand our last point of comparison, that is presence of Active Directory. So work group, there is no Active Directory in a work group network. In a domain network, the network becomes a domain network because of Active Directory. So whenever we install Active Directory domain services, that network becomes a domain network. So Active Directory brings in client server architecture, centralized administration and management, global logon and authentication, and it's more secured compared to our work group network. So let us summarize what we have covered in today's session. So we have seen what is a client, we have seen what is a server, we have seen the difference between a workgroup environment and a domain environment. We have also seen the Windows operating system network models, and we have seen the difference between the workgroup environment and a domain environment on the basis of architecture, administration and management, logon and authentication, security, implementation, and presence of Active Directory. So this is the end of part 11. Hope you have enjoyed today's session. Thank you again for joining, and if you feel this channel is helping you to learn anything new, please share and subscribe this video with your technical community. And have a great day.